You are listening to the global network of podcasters dedicated to the pharmacy profession. Welcome to the Pharmacy Podcast Network.
Welcome back to Essential, the pharmacy compounding podcast with the latest news and analysis from you-know-who, the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding, the voice for compounding pharmacy. I'm your host, Andrew Cantor, and today we've got something a little different. There are two big stories in the world of pharmacy compounding going on right now, and they're both important enough that we want to do kind of a double deep dive. The first is a broad effort on the part of a couple of big drug makers to get laws passed that make compounding a lot more difficult, and it is a broad effort. We'll get to that in a sec. The other is a public statement by the FDA on February 6th that the agency is looking at restricting semaglutide and tirzepatide as active pharmaceutical ingredients. The statement was kind of cryptic. It wasn't like the agency was announcing a new policy or anything. It was just kind of thinking out loud. So everyone's guessing what might happen next. But before we get to that, let's go back to talking about what's going on in the States. When I said pharma companies were making a broad effort to restrict compounding, I mean they've literally authored legislation to do that, to limit compounding, and they've managed to get it introduced in about 10 states. To talk about all this and what it means, my guest is APC's CEO, Scott Brunner, who is obviously chin deep in all these issues. Welcome, Scott.
It's actually deeper than that, Andrew. I'm pretty short, so my chin's not that tall. But thanks. I'm glad to be here.
So rather than go through every state, since all these bills are pretty similar, let's talk in general terms. What is the gist of these bills that the pharma companies are introducing, and why are the companies pushing for them?
Well, it's a coordinated effort. Across the country, Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk are pitching legislators on a neat, scary story. They're saying that licensed compounding pharmacies are some sort of shadow supply chain, that compounded GLP-1s are inherently suspect, and that these sweeping new state-level restrictions framed as patient safety or anti-counterfeiting measures are the only possible responsible response. And yet that story is a fantasy. And unfortunately, in the 9 or 10 states, too many lawmakers are acting on them without checking the facts. We know that Drugmakers, since last summer, end of last summer, Drugmakers had been shopping legislation with legislators in various states. We had received copies of drafts, and then shortly after the first of the year, it's legislative session season across the country, and bills began to be introduced. The interesting thing about the legislation is that they have been pitched to legislators as anti-counterfeiting. Let's cut out illicit substances coming into the country from offshore. In effect, though, the bills don't do anything about the black market or the gray market or counterfeiting or illicit substances. The bills do nothing to make patients safer. And in fact, the bills impose on state-licensed compounding pharmacies standards that are very difficult for those pharmacies to meet. They basically impose manufacturer-level standards, CGMP, current good manufacturing practice standards, on independent pharmacies that prepare one drug for one patient. The standards, though, for CGMP are for manufacturers of drugs that make millions of doses for millions of patients. And so many of the pharmacies aren't going to be able to adhere to the testing requirements, those testing requirements, by the way, that have already been done at both the manufacturer and the wholesaler level and documented in a certificate of analysis. And so the result is going to be impede patient access to certain compounded therapies. Some of these bills have been very broad and affect all compounded therapies. Others have been fairly tailored, shall we say, to only restrict GLP-1 compounding, or the Florida bill, for instance, would restrict compounding of weight loss drugs. And weight loss is not defined, so that's going to sweep in to those restrictions and requirements well more than just GLP-1s. So we have undertaken, APC has undertaken with our sister association, the Outsourcing Facilities Association, an effort to push back against this threat. It's called the Compounding Defense Initiative, and I'll be happy to say more about it.
Okay, before we go any further, I just want to rattle off the list of states so that listeners can, if they're in one of these states, they'll know it's going to affect them. So far, there are bills, anti-compounding bills being introduced in Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Indiana, Mississippi, Virginia, Washington State, Georgia, and possibly Pennsylvania. When I look at this list, I see nothing in common with these states. They're geographically diverse, they're red, they're blue, they're all over the place. Why have drug makers chosen these states to introduce the bills?
It's a great question, and we've been looking for some theme, some pattern, and there doesn't seem to be one. As you say, Virginia's a purple state, Florida is a red state, Mississippi's a red state, Colorado's a blue state. And so we don't think that flavor of partisanship really has anything to do with it. At the end of the day, I think they have found traction in states where they found a chair or a vice chair of a committee of jurisdiction in that particular legislature who is willing to introduce the bill for them. And indeed, that's their strategy. We are finding that in most of these states where it's been introduced, the chairman of a committee, in a couple of instances, a vice chairman, has introduced the bill, which makes it, frankly, harder for members of the committee to push back against if they're opposed. Nobody likes to go up against a chairman. So that seems to be the only pattern that we can discern.
Okay. Now, obviously, to be a cynic here, the drug companies are doing this to protect their market share, their shareholders.
Do you think?
I think a little bit. They're trying to make their shareholders happy. And obviously, they're not pitching it that way to legislators. You mentioned that they're saying there are issues with counterfeiting, there are issues with gray market drugs. Are those real issues? It's easy to say they're pitching bills to fight something that doesn't exist. But from what I understand, there is some problem with gray market and counterfeit drugs. But, how big a problem is it really?
Well, the counterfeit market and illicit substances purporting to be GLP-1s and a range of other drugs coming into this country is a seriously legitimate problem, and some crackdown on that is absolutely due. We need more enforcement, but that's not what these bills do. And I should assert, illicit substances coming into this country are not going to state licensed compounding pharmacies. A pharmacy that is sourcing API from a non-FDA registered, inspected, deemed CGMP compliant manufacturer will not have a pharmacy license for long, because state boards of pharmacy come in with regularity once a year or so and inspect. They're looking at those prescriptions, and a pharmacy that's not sourcing appropriately would immediately be written up. They could be fined. They could lose their license. It's a serious infraction. And so as a business strategy, that just doesn't work for a state licensed pharmacy. These substances coming into the country are going to illicit actors. The National Association of Boards of Pharmacy says that as high as 90% of online pharmacies are bogus. And it's those entities that are peddling these illicit substances, purporting to be something that they may or may not be. And patients who are getting those substances without a prescription, that are getting advice in a Reddit chat room where somebody tells them they can buy a lyophilized powder and order it from overseas, and then hop down to the Walgreens and get some distilled water in a syringe and inject themselves. That's a case of meningitis waiting to happen.
Wait. Are you actually saying, and I want you on the record for this, are you actually saying that if I get medical advice and I buy some random weight loss drug off of a link on TikTok, that I'm taking a risk here?
You think? I'm sorry, getting your healthcare advice from TikTok is probably not a good strategy for survival, shall we say? Seriously, I'm being glib, but that is actually happening. I mean, you can go in those chat rooms and get advice for where you can get these substances that don't come from a state licensed pharmacy, that are not from FDA registered manufacturers and wholesalers. And so that needs to be addressed, but that's not what these bills do. These bills take state licensed pharmacies that operate under the U.S. Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and FDA guidance and state pharmacy law and the standards of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, the compounding chapters, which are rigorous standards for preparing one drug for one patient and imposing on those pharmacies additional standards that they can't meet. And the interesting thing about both the drug maker strategy, and I respect state legislators greatly. I think they are serving their constituents, but I find it a bit frustrating that some of them are interested in introducing or voting for these bills, and they've not reached out to the State Board of Pharmacy to ask, hey, you regulators over this industry, is this a legitimate problem? Do we really need this overlay of new regulation on state licensed pharmacies? Generally speaking, that has not happened. And so drug makers are selling to these legislators a problem that doesn't exist with state licensed pharmacies. And yet it's a serious threat.
And then they're solving it, or purporting to solve it, with a sledgehammer.
You got
essentially.
This whole strategy is a blunt instrument. Now, look, I think if you want to have a conversation about opportunism in the GLP-1 compounding space, that's a conversation we can have. And we might find we would certainly find areas of disagreement, but we might find areas in which we agreed. These bills, not a one of them, and they're all very similar, by the way. There's a Novo version, there's a Lilly version. They're very similar, and yet in the 9 states where they've been introduced, not a one of them is exactly the same, but they all are sort of cut from the same cloth, and they don't do anything to even address that problem. And so I think this is a sledgehammer where, if anything's needed, it was a scalpel.
So you mentioned you're fighting back through the Compounding Defense Initiative, ABC and its partners. And so far, based on my notes, you've won legislative battles already, at least 5 of them, 5 different states. You've had the bills, you've been able to get the bills squashed either in committee or subcommittee. But here's a question to speculate. What if one of these bills passed? Pick any of the states that's got one. What would happen for patients? What would happen for pharmacists if the bill passed as Eli Lilly or Novo Nordisk has written? And as an aside, just the idea that drug companies are writing bills, and as I understand it, they actually are writing these bills and then giving them to state legislators and saying, hey, here's the bill we'd like you to introduce. That, I don't know, that just kind of goes against Civics 101 for me.
Well, maybe only because you're thinking that way, only because it's a corporation, but that happens all the time. Entities, I mean, we work with Congress and urge members of Congress to pass legislation that protects patient access to compounded drugs. What's interesting about this strategy by drug makers is that it is so brazenly protectionist. They are carving out their GLP-1 drugs and putting extra restrictions on the compounding of the drugs. And so the practical effect, I mean, the drug makers will say all day long, oh, we're not prohibiting compounding of GLP-1s. Well, in most of these instances, they're putting in place requirements that the pharmacies aren't going to be able to meet. And even those who might be able to meet those additional requirements beyond state license law, beyond USP, are going to incur additional cost, which makes the ability of the patient to afford, they're going to have to raise the prices. And so the ability of the patient to afford the drug and therefore access the drug is at risk. In some of these, patient access will be cut off as a result of these bills if they were to pass. In other states, the access would become much more difficult. And again, I can't say enough how brazen an approach this is. It is trying to, it's almost like regulatory capture. It's writing into law a protection for your product.
So, okay, you've got, as we've said, nine bills introduced. You've won a bunch of them. There are still several that are in various stages of the legislative process. What happens next? Are there more you see being introduced? Have you heard rumors of this? And what is the Compounding Defense Initiative planning next to deal with the issue?
Well, it's a great question. So we saw this coming back in the fall when we began to hear about the drug makers shopping the bills. We did not know at that point what the scope of the uptake would be. I mean, the fact that we don't have 50 states where these bills are introduced tells me that in many states, they couldn't find a drug maker who was willing to introduce this bad legislation.
Whoops. Scott meant to say that they couldn't find lawmakers to introduce these bills, not drug makers.
In the 9 states where the bills have been introduced, we have been able to either have set aside or to kill the bills. And I mean, it's 5 of them, so you may have to help me, Andrew. Virginia was the first state where the bill was set aside. 2 bills in Florida died in committee. Mississippi committee voted to kill the bill. Arizona, and that's as of this time we're recording, Arizona's the most recent one. And there was a tie vote in the Committee of Jurisdiction, and on a tie vote, the bill dies. So that one was a squeaker and worrisome. And then Washington State was just overwhelmingly put down. I think that may be 5 states. We still have bills pending in Indiana, Eli Lilly's home state. And the bill in Indiana is right now the bill that has made it the farthest. The Senate basically gutted the original bill and made some changes that would apply would put med spas, and we need to talk about med spas, by the way, put med spas within the reach of state boards of pharmacy, and then would incorporate sections 503A and 503B of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act into Indiana law. It went over to the House, and recently the House has made further significant changes to the bill, most of which this has only just happened in the past 24 hours. Most of those we think we can live with. We are still reviewing. We do have a bill in Colorado that has not yet had hearing, and we have my concern is that in some of these states we have legislators that are believing the fantasy that the drug makers have sold them, despite not hearing from boards of pharmacy about legitimate concerns. And so, I'm a little concerned about Colorado, and then Georgia is the most recent one, and my suspicion is that we'll be fine in Georgia, and the bill will not get out of the House there. We're hearing rumors of a bill to be introduced in Pennsylvania. It may be that by the time this episode airs, something will have been introduced there. It's not more states because they couldn't find anybody to introduce it. We have pulled together a coalition, the Outsourcing Facilities Association, that's the trade association that represents 503B outsourcing facilities, and us, and we represent both 503A and 503B. We are certainly raising money from our members to engage lobbyists in all of these states. We have been very fortunate in several of these states to be able to collaborate with the state pharmacy associations. And most of these state pharmacy associations have taken a position in opposition to the bill or have been integrally involved in helping improve the legislation. Indiana's a good example of that. Can't say enough good things about the Indiana Pharmacist Association and their work to improve the bill. Washington State Pharmacist Association, fantastic. Arizona. And so we're grateful to sort of have this clunky coalition of folks who are trying to tell legislators the truth about what's going on. I think our track record is pretty good. And I babbled on. Your real question was what happens next. We still have some states in which the legislative timeline is such that a bill could be introduced. So there may be a state where we're going to see a bill that we don't yet know about. But for most states, the deadline for introduction of new legislation has passed. And so we begin to look toward next year. We do, by the way, have to be vigilant in watching some of these bills because amendments can be made to other bills that might be judged germane late in session. And so even though we it looks like we put a bill down in Florida, it may be that somebody could attach the language of the bad legislation to another piece of legislation. And so we're having to keep watch for that. As we move toward the summer, this is not a one and done. I do not believe drug makers are going to say, oh, well, we tried that in 9 states. Didn't work, or it didn't work the way we thought it would. We're out. They've got infinite resources. They got more money than God, as my grandmother would say. And I believe we will see a return of this strategy next year, and they will have learned from some lessons from what's occurred this year. I think as an industry, we're going to have to be ready for that, and you will see APC preparing for the fight to continue as we go forward.
Okay. We've been talking about mostly GLP-1, weight loss, diabetes drugs, and that's what most of the legislation seems to be targeting, although in some cases it's a much broader target of compounding in general, but the focus seems to be on GLP-1 drugs. So I'd like to transition over to the federal level. Because of that statement that I mentioned earlier from FDA Commissioner Makary. He's talking in a statement, he alluded to limiting or even prohibiting compounding with the active ingredient, the API, that's in these GLP-1 weight loss and diabetes drugs, semaglutide, tirzepatide, notably. Right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, as long as a prescriber says that a patient needs a compounded version of semaglutide or tirzepatide, it's perfectly legal for a compounding pharmacist to use those APIs to make formulations. It's up to the prescriber believes it, then it's legal to do this. So can the FDA just snap its fingers and restrict 1 or 2 APIs that are already legal to compound with?
Okay, there's a lot wrapped up there. So first of all, I'm going to correct you.
Okay.
Federal law allows prescribing or dispensing of a compounded drug when an FDA-approved drug is in shortage. FDA guidance allows compounding pharmacies to make what FDA calls essentially a copy of the FDA-approved drug. That's when the drug's in shortage. Semaglutide, tirzepatide, FDA has deemed them out of shortage now, and so that does not apply. There should be no making of essentially copies of FDA-approved GLP-1 drugs right now. On the other hand, the other instance in which compounding is authorized is when a prescriber, in her judgment, determines that a specific formulation for an individual patient is needed, and there's not an FDA-approved drug corollary to that specific formulation. She needs a different dosage form or dosage strength or combination of drugs for that individual patient. And so in that regard, yes, what you said is true. The criteria for substances that can be used in compounding, there's a threefold criteria, or it's one of these three. It has to be a component of an FDA-approved drug. Well, semaglutide, tirzepatide are components of FDA-approved drugs. Or it needs to have a national formulary or USP monograph, or it needs to be on this curated list that FDA keeps. It has a slightly fancier title, but it's the 503A bulks list. And so in the environment that we're in right now, if a prescriber judges that a custom formulation of semaglutide or tirzepatide is appropriate for an individual patient, she can write a prescription for that compounded drug for that patient. Again, compounders can only use active ingredient that comes, and this is in the law as well, has to come from an FDA registered facility. And generally, one would presume that that is FDA inspected and deemed to be CGMP compliant. And indeed, FDA back in the fall created a green list of GLP-1 manufacturers that it deemed to be CGMP compliant. Some of them had been inspected. They were all FDA registered, but FDA was, by putting them on the green list, deeming them to meet the criteria for compounding. And so as long as a pharmacy is acquiring the API from one of those, by our reading of the law, they should be able to do that. And so what was unusual about Dr. McCary's statement was the stridency of it. I think the timing was interesting. It came on the heels of what I would characterize as a provocative move by a telehealth platform. And it makes us wonder exactly what the commissioner has in mind. I don't know that just across the board, FDA has the ability to prohibit the use of an active pharmaceutical ingredient when it is an ingredient that is authorized, that meets the criteria in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and FDA has already deemed that it's safe for use in an FDA-approved drug. So are they talking about import restrictions on certain manufacturers? Well, that will be interesting if they've released the green list back in the late summer or fall, and now they're going to put import restrictions on API from some of those manufacturers that they had deemed in compliance back in the fall. That seems to be an odd thing to do. Certainly, they could bow to the demands of the drug makers and move to add the GLP-1 API to the demonstrably difficult to compound list. I would argue that the drug makers' arguments for doing that are remarkably flimsy, but it doesn't mean FDA could not do it. Even so, adding drugs to the demonstrably difficult to compound list, a list, by the way, which is not finalized, it technically doesn't exist because the criteria has not been finalized by the agency yet. But let's say they did that, you're going to have to go through a protracted notice and comment rulemaking period to do that. So if that's the course they take, I kind of hope they don't. I think the science, as I've said, is flimsy. It's going to take a while to do that. Notice and comment rulemaking is not a quick process. And so all of that is pure speculation. If there are other tools in their books or in their bag of tricks, I guess, for restricting GLP-1 compounding, I'm not quite sure what they are. The other thing that should be noted, though, the commissioner did say that they intend to restrict compounding with GLP-1 API. His statements, and multiple statements, not just the one that was released on the 6th, but a tweet on the 5th, said more about advertising and marketing claims and mass advertising of mass marketing of compounded GLP-1 drugs. And we've already got some clues there as to how the agency is handling that. They have sent warning letters. In fact, the majority of the warning letters have gone to manufacturers of FDA-approved drugs for inappropriate claims. But some of those went to telehealth platforms. Some of them went to compounding pharmacies. I'll wrap up in a minute. But one little nuance that is interesting to us is FDA has sent warning letters to compounding pharmacies questioning statements in the pharmacy's marketing of its compounded GLP-1 drugs, stating that the active pharmaceutical ingredient in the drug is the same active ingredient as in the FDA-approved drug. Yeah, and Dr. McCary seems to be questioning, and the agency in its letters seem to be questioning that statement. But I would assert, Andrew, that has to be a true statement. I mean, if the API is not a component of the FDA-approved drug, you can't be compounding with it in the first place. And so we're trying to figure out is there something more precise about those claims that FDA is concerned about? Because on its face, it's a true statement.
Yeah, that's something that confused me about that part of the statement, is that compounding pharmacists are using the same active ingredients as in the FDA-approved drugs. It's semaglutide. It is a molecule that looks like this. It's tirzepatide. It's a molecule that looks like that. It is the same molecule, the same active ingredients, but saying that you can't say that you're using the same active ingredient. I mean, I look at medication all the time, and I'll see, it'll say acetaminophen, the same active ingredient as Tylenol, but it's a generic version. There's no problem there.
Well, and it may have, I mean, I'm speculating. I'm not a lawyer. It may be the use of the trademark term, same active ingredient as in Wegovy. Maybe that's the concern, that it's so specific to the commercial name of the drug. I don't know, but we're waiting for the other shoe to drop. We're waiting to see what the agency will actually do in this regard. So,
well, let's go take a step back and look at the bigger picture with those statements. Why would FDA Commissioner McCurry say stuff like this? Why? I mean, wouldn't the FDA want patients to get the drugs in the formulations that their prescribers say is appropriate? Wouldn't the FDA want patients to get the right drugs, whether it comes with an Eli Lilly brand on it, or it comes from a state licensed compounding pharmacy? Why is the FDA doing this? Or threatening to do this?
Yeah, pure speculation. But again, some of it had to do with timing. On February 5th, you had a telehealth platform make a remarkably provocative marketing move. And I would view Dr. McCurry's response as a direct response to that. I would suspect that FDA heard immediately from the Drugmakers and were feeling pressure to respond to this move by the telehealth platform, and this is how it came out. I don't know beyond that, but it has to be tied in one way or the other to the action by the telehealth platform. I just don't see any other reason the agency would sort of arbitrarily make that sort of announcement.
All right. So a lot of big and related issues going on here at the state level with bills that would restrict compounding, specifically in some cases of GLP-1 drugs. You've got the federal level with insinuations, threats, however you want to describe it, against compounding pharmacies for their marketing and for dispensing legally, at this point, legally dispensing these drugs. Yeah, first of all, thank you for taking the time. As I said before, you're up to your chin, at least in dealing with this. So for the listeners, where can people get more information? The state level issues, the FDA issues, is there an easy place for them to get the updates on what's happening?
Yeah, well, the best thing you can do is join APC. We would love to have more in our community of compounding pharmacies and compounding stakeholders. On the multi-state legislative threat, compounding.com is your best resource. We have set up individual pages for the landing pages, I guess, for the states where this legislation has been introduced. You should be able to find a copy of the bill, our analysis of the bill. In some of these states, we've issued calls to action for residents of the state, prescribers in the state, to reach out to members of their legislature. So there's a lot there at compounding.com. In terms of FDA's statement, I mean, again, if you're a member of APC, you get our weekly newsletter. We're speaking and addressing this issue and sharing what we know weekly in that venue. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, and we should be able to keep you in the know there as well.
All right. Thank you. That was, again, Scott Bruner. He is the CEO of the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding. And before we play the outro music, if you are a compounding pharmacist or a technician, or if you prescribe compounding meds, as Scott pointed out, APC is there for you. It's helping you. It's helping your patients. So not to go through everything APC does, but certainly in terms of keeping up with the latest regulations and the threats to compounding, APC is the biggest, the loudest trade association for compounding. So if you're not a member, you should consider becoming one. APC is working for you. You can find out more at a4pc.org. That's A4pc.org. And as Scott mentioned, on compounding.com. And now we can play that outro music. Thanks, everybody, for listening.